I entered the little garden house without expecting to meet anyone. The smell of flowers and wet earth enveloped me as soon as I opened the door. But what really took my breath away was the sight of Jake, the gardener, shirtless. He had his back to me, fiddling with some tools. When he turned around, our gazes met, and at that moment, the air became heavy with tension. "Do you need anything?" Jake asked, his voice low and husky. I felt my heart racing, my breathing becoming labored. There was something in his eyes, a glint that left me intrigued and disturbed at the same time. How did we get to this point? The question echoed in my mind as I struggled to find words. "I just came to get some seeds," I stammered, looking away, trying to ignore the electricity that seemed to pulse between us. Jake took a step towards me, and for a second, I thought he was going to touch me. But he just pointed to a shelf off to the side. "They're over there." I thanked him with a nod, trying to keep my composure. I picked up the seeds with trembling hands, feeling his gaze burning into my back. When I finally made it out of the little house, my heart was still racing. I needed to understand how and why that tension was there. I was married to Michael, but something in Jake stirred up feelings that I thought were dormant. Every furtive encounter, every exchange of glances over the last few days, everything seemed to lead us to that moment. As I walked back to the house, I couldn't help wondering what would happen if I couldn't resist this growing attraction, and above all, how it would affect my marriage to Michael. When I entered the little house in the garden, I didn't expect to find Jake there, shirtless. The shock was instantaneous. My eyes went wide, and the air seemed to escape from my lungs. He was sweaty, breathing heavily, and his muscles glistened in the soft light coming through the windows. "Sorry, I didn't know you'd be here," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice shook. Jake looked at me, and a smile played on his lips. "It's okay. I was just finishing work today." The tension in the air was palpable. Our gazes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it. My breathing was fast and ragged. A silent question hung between us. How did we get to this point? I remembered the day Jake started working in the garden. Michael and I needed someone to look after the plants while we were busy with our jobs. When Jake showed up for the first time, something in me lit up. His presence was striking, his posture confident. Even though I was married to Michael, I couldn't help but be immediately attracted to him. "Hi, I'm Jake, the new gardener," he said, smiling as he shook my hand. "Nice to meet you. I'm Amanda," I replied, trying to control the wave of heat that surged through my body. Since that first greeting, full of smiles and exchanges of glances, something had changed in me. Over the next few weeks, I discovered that we had many interests in common. We talked about music, literature, and even cooking. Every casual conversation seemed to bring us closer together. Jake started working longer hours in the garden. There always seemed to be a new project that warranted his constant presence. During those hours, we would discuss details and plan what to do next. The closeness was inevitable. One day, while we were talking about the new flower bed, his arm, accidentally, brushed against my hand. An electric shock ran through my body. I looked at him in surprise and saw that he felt it too. Our gazes met again, and for a moment, the world around us disappeared. The conversations became more and more intimate and personal. We talked about our dreams, fears, and desires. The sexual tension between us grew every day. I felt overwhelming guilt every time I looked at Michael in the living room, but I couldn't help what was happening. "We need to talk," Jake said one day, while we were in the little house in the garden. I knew what he meant. Before I could reply, he came over and kissed me. It was a stolen kiss, unexpected, but full of intensity. My body responded immediately, and for a moment, I forgot everything around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Guilt and excitement mixed inside me. The next day, I made an impulsive decision. I met Jake in the garden at night. The sexual tension was almost unbearable. When we finally gave ourselves to each other, the passion was intense and overwhelming. The next morning, the remorse was there, but there was also a new excitement. What we were doing was wrong, but the adrenaline of each secret encounter was addictive. "We need to be careful," I told Jake one day. "Michael can't find out." "I know," he replied, holding my hand. "But I can't stop thinking about you." The secret routine became part of my life. Pretending to be normal with Michael was increasingly difficult, but the frequent encounters with Jake in the little house in the garden were irresistible. The pleasure of taking risks and the constant adrenaline kept me in a state of euphoria and fear. I created elaborate lies for Michael about meetings and appointments. Each secret meeting with Jake revealed a new level of intimacy between us. Unbridled passion and the fear of being found out were mixed in a whirlwind of emotions. Keeping our composure when Michael was around was a constant challenge. Fantasies about Jake became more and more daring. My guilt grew every time I saw Michael sleeping next to me, but the need to make quick decisions to avoid suspicion was urgent. Jake suggested one day, "Let's spend a weekend out of town." The idea was tempting. I created an elaborate lie for Michael about a work trip. In the hotel room far from home, the passion was unbridled, but the fear of being found out was always there, mixed with the adrenaline of being with Jake. I decided to continue with the affair and keep it a secret. My life was divided between moments with Michael and encounters with Jake. Separating the emotions between these two worlds was an almost impossible task. But the certainty that the betrayal would continue, without revelations or consequences, gave me a strange sense of control and desire. Jake's need to work longer hours in the garden became apparent when we decided to expand the project. Michael was increasingly absent, traveling for work, and I often found myself alone at home. Jake offered to devote more time to the garden, and I accepted without hesitation. As we discussed the details of the project, the closeness between us grew. "I think we could add some rose bushes here. What do you think?" Jake asked, pointing to a corner of the garden. I moved closer to get a better look, and our shoulders touched. I felt a shiver run through my body, but I tried to ignore it. "Yes, I think it's going to be beautiful," I replied, trying to keep my composure. The days went by, and every time Jake accidentally touched my hand, an electric current ran through my body. It was as if the mere contact of his skin on mine ignited a spark that I couldn't control. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," he said, but his eyes said otherwise. The tension between us was becoming more and more palpable. Sometimes I found myself watching him as he worked, his muscular back and strong arms sweaty from the effort. I knew it was wrong, that I was married to Michael, but I couldn't help it. One day, while we were checking the position of the new plants, our hands touched again. This time, neither of us moved away. We just stood there, feeling the electricity run through our bodies. I started to say, but my voice failed me. "I know," Jake replied, his eyes fixed on mine. At that moment, I realized that we weren't just discussing the garden. Something much deeper was happening between us. His simple touch made my heart race, and I knew I couldn't ignore this attraction any longer. "We need to be careful," I whispered, feeling my heart beating uncontrollably. "I know that, but it's hard when we're so close all the time," he replied, his voice low and husky. From that day on, our encounters in the garden became even more intense. Every exchange of glances, every accidental touch, seemed to carry a hidden meaning. I wondered how we got to that point, but the answer was there, clear as day. The attraction between us was undeniable. The work in the garden continued, and every day, the closeness between Jake and me grew. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't resist. Every moment with him was a mixture of adrenaline and desire, and I could no longer ignore the feelings that were growing inside me. "I feel guilty," I confessed to him one day, while we were alone in the little house in the garden. "So do I. But I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice full of sincerity. From that moment on, we knew we were walking a dangerous path. He took a step towards me, and I felt a wave of warmth run through my body. "Thank you," he said, taking the glass from my hand. His fingers brushed mine, and that simple touch awakened something inside me. I pulled away a little, trying to regain control. "It's very hot today," I said, more to break the silence than anything else. "Yes, it is," he replied, but his eyes were still fixed on mine, as if searching for something deeper. The silent question hung between us. How did we get to this point? I was married to Michael, and I never thought I could feel something like this for someone else. But there I was, unable to deny the attraction I felt for Jake. "I should go," I muttered, but my feet wouldn't move. Jake took another step towards me, his presence dominating the small space of the little garden house. "Maybe you should," he said, but the intensity in his eyes said otherwise. I knew I needed to get out of there before something irrevocable happened, but my body seemed to have a mind of its own. The sound of footsteps on the gravel outside brought us back to reality. I quickly turned around and left the cottage, trying to regain my composure. On the way home, my thoughts were in turmoil. I knew it was wrong, that I shouldn't feel the way I did. But the tension between us was undeniable, as if something bigger than the two of us was about to happen. When I entered the house, Michael was in the living room, reading a book. He looked up and smiled at me, a smile full of love and trust. Guilt hit me like a wave. I loved Michael, but something about Jake tugged at me in a way I couldn't explain. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, noticing my troubled expression. "Yeah, just tired," I lied, giving him a quick kiss on the forehead. As I climbed the stairs to our room, my hands were shaking. I knew I needed to sort out what was happening to me, but all I could think about was the look in Jake's eyes, the way he made me feel alive, in a way I hadn't felt for a long time. As I lay in bed, I tried to push those thoughts away. I needed to remember that I had a life, a husband who loved me. But the image of Jake shirtless, the touch of his fingers on mine, continued to haunt me. The question still echoed in my mind. How did we get to this point? And more importantly, how would I get out of it without destroying everything I had built with Michael? I fell asleep with these thoughts, my heart still racing, my breath panting, and the certainty that this was only the beginning of something I didn't know if I could control. Entering the little house in the garden that night was an impulsive decision. I could no longer resist the tension that had been building up between Jake and me. The air was charged with desire, and the surrounding darkness seemed to intensify every sensation. When I opened the door, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. There was Jake, waiting for me. He was shirtless, his muscular body illuminated only by the dim moonlight coming through the windows. Our gazes met, and I felt a wave of heat run through my body. My breathing became faster, and for a moment, I wondered how we had gotten to this point. "You came," said Jake, his voice husky and full of desire. I simply nodded, unable to formulate words. The tension between us was almost unbearable. He took a step towards me, and I felt my skin tingle. Every fiber of my being yearned for him, despite the guilt that throbbed somewhere in the back of my mind. I couldn't stay away, I confessed, my heart racing. Jake moved even closer, and I could feel the heat emanating from his body. He lifted his hand and touched my face, gently, as if he feared I was going to disappear. I closed my eyes, enjoying the touch I had been craving for so long. "Me neither," he murmured, before tilting his head and capturing my lips in his. The kiss was urgent, full of need. My hands found his chest, feeling the muscles under the warm skin. Jake pulled me closer, and I could feel every inch of his body against mine. The sensation was intoxicating, and for a moment, the whole outside world ceased to exist. "We can't," I began, but Jake stopped me with another kiss, deeper and more intense. "Just tonight," he whispered against my lips. "Just tonight, please." I knew I was crossing a line from which there would be no turning back, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. The passion between us was overwhelming, and I didn't want to fight it. Jake guided me to an old wooden bed in the corner of the cottage, and there, our bodies joined with an almost desperate urgency. The night passed in a blur of touches, kisses, and sighs. Jake's every move seemed to set my skin on fire, and I lost myself completely in the pleasure he was giving me. The little house in the garden, which had once been just a place to work, became a haven of desire and passion. When morning came, the soft light of dawn began to invade the space, bringing with it a cold and harsh reality. Jake was still beside me, his eyes closed, his breathing quiet. I, on the other hand, felt an overwhelming mixture of remorse and excitement. What we had done was wrong, but at the same time, it was the most intense thing I had ever experienced. I got up quietly, trying not to wake him. As I got dressed, my thoughts were a mess. How would I face Michael after this? How could I look at him and not feel the weight of guilt? But more than that, how could I stay away from Jake now that we had crossed this barrier? Jake stirred in bed, and I turned to see him slowly open his eyes. He looked at me with an expression that mixed sadness and satisfaction. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. I just nodded, unable to find words. I knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same. I left the little house in the garden with a heavy heart, but also with a strange feeling of completeness. I didn't know how to deal with what came next, but one thing was certain. That night with Jake would change everything. Walking home, each step seemed heavier than the last. The little house in the garden now carried memories that could never be erased. And I, with my heart torn between guilt and desire, knew that I had taken a path of no return. Keeping an affair a secret was more difficult than I had imagined. Every day, when I woke up next to Michael, my husband, I felt a heaviness in my chest. I knew I was living a double life, and the guilt consumed me. But at the same time, there was an undeniable adrenaline rush to it all, an excitement that I couldn't ignore. Pretending to be normal with Michael was a constant challenge. He was a good man, always so attentive and caring. But even so, something inside me yearned for Jake. Every time I looked at Michael, a part of me felt betrayed, but the other part felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. "Are you okay?" Michael asked one evening while we were having dinner. "Yeah, I'm just a bit tired," I replied, forcing a smile. He accepted my answer without question, which only increased my guilt. The encounters with Jake in the little house in the garden became frequent. Every time I went out to see him, my heart beat faster. I knew we were taking risks, but that only made it more intense. Every touch, every kiss, seemed even more urgent and forbidden. "Are you sure no one will catch us?" Jake asked once, as he pulled me into his arms. "Everything will be fine," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. There was something incredibly addictive about our secret meetings. The adrenaline of being discovered, the pleasure of being with him, all mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions. but maintaining this secret routine had its price. Every day it became harder to pretend that everything was normal at home. Michael began to notice that I was distracted, and I knew I couldn't go on like this for long. "You've been going out a lot lately," he commented one evening while we were watching TV. "It's just work," I lied, feeling a lump in my throat. "Too many meetings and appointments?" Michael accepted my excuse, but I knew I couldn't use it forever. Every day, the line between my life with Michael and my dates with Jake became thinner, and I had to be careful. "When are we going to see each other again?" Jake asked, as we said goodbye in the little house in the garden. "Soon," I promised, although I didn't know exactly when it would be safe to meet again. The constant adrenaline of living this double life was overwhelming. There were times when I wondered how I had got to this point, but then I remembered how alive Jake made me feel. Every encounter, every touch, reminded me of what I was missing in my everyday life. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. The need to be with Jake, to feel that passion, was stronger than anything I had ever experienced. And so, I continued to live this secret routine, always on the edge of the precipice, not knowing what the future held. Creating lies for Michael about meetings and appointments became a skill I never imagined I would develop. Every time I made up an excuse, I felt a pang of guilt, but the attraction for Jake was irresistible. "I need to go to the office early tomorrow, Michael. We have an important meeting," I said, trying to sound convincing as we ate breakfast. He just nodded, concentrating on his newspaper. With Jake, I discovered a level of intimacy I had never experienced before. Every encounter was a plunge into a world of unbridled passion. In the little house in the garden, where it all began, our conversations became confessionals of desires and dreams. "You make me feel alive, Jake," I confessed as he pulled me closer, his eyes fixed on mine, full of desire. "You too, Sarah. I've never felt this way about anyone," he replied, and his words ignited a flame inside me. Every secret encounter was a mixture of fear and excitement. The danger of being discovered made it all the more intense. "Are you sure Michael doesn't suspect anything?" Jake asked one night, as we prepared for another date. "I am. He trusts me blindly," I said, trying to push away the guilt that threatened to consume me. But the truth was that every time I told Michael I had an appointment or a meeting, my heart beat faster, and adrenaline took over. "I'm going out for a meeting, love. Don't wait up for me," I said one night, kissing him lightly on the lips. He smiled, wishing me good luck, without suspecting a thing. And so I continued to live this double life, torn between the man I married and the gardener who aroused a passion I never knew existed. My lies became more and more elaborate, and the need to be with Jake only grew. "Sarah, I don't know how much longer we can go on like this," Jake said one night as we got dressed after another intense encounter. "I know, Jake, but I can't think about being without you," I replied, feeling the weight of the situation. With each encounter, the fear of being discovered was always present, but the excitement of being with Jake outweighed any other emotion. Danger seemed to be an aphrodisiac, making every moment together even more intense. If Michael finds out, it's all over, I thought countless times. But even so, I couldn't stop. The unbridled passion and desire to be with Jake were stronger than any fear. "Sarah, you need to decide what you want," Jake said on one of our dates. "We can't go on like this forever." "I know, Jake, but for now, I just want to enjoy every moment with you," I replied, kissing him fervently, trying to keep reality at bay for a while longer. And so we continued, trapped in a cycle of lies, passion, and fear, not knowing where it would lead, but unable to stop. Keeping my composure when Michael was around was a constant challenge. Every time he hugged me or looked at me with those eyes full of love and trust, my heart squeezed. I felt a mixture of guilt and excitement eating me up inside. With each passing day, it became harder to hide my feelings for Jake. My fantasies about him became bolder and more frequent. At night, while Michael slept next to me, I would lose myself in thoughts about Jake, reliving every touch, every kiss, every passionate moment we shared in the little house in the garden. One morning, while Michael was having coffee in the kitchen, he asked, "Darling, you seem distracted lately. Is everything all right?" I felt a chill run down my spine, but forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm just a bit tired. Work, you know." He looked at me with concern, but accepted my excuse. I knew I had to make quick decisions to avoid suspicion. Once, when he suggested going away for the weekend to relax, I made up an excuse about an unavoidable appointment. "Maybe next week, love. I've got an important meeting I can't put off." But the truth was that I couldn't imagine being away from Jake for so long. I needed him, the intensity he brought to my life. And with every secret meeting, I felt like we were playing with fire. He seemed to sense my state of mind. "Is everything all right?" he asked, holding my hand tightly. "I'm afraid Michael will find out," I confessed, looking into his eyes. "Me too," he replied, squeezing my hand. "But I can't stay away from you." These words gave me strength, but also increased my guilt. At night, lying next to Michael, I watched his serene face and wondered how I could keep up this charade. But my desire for Jake was uncontrollable. Every time we were together, I felt an electricity that I had never experienced before. And that was what kept me attached to him, even though I knew I was wrong. The challenge of keeping my composure became greater every day. Michael began to notice small changes in me, subtly questioning my apologies and absences. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked again one evening as we watched TV together. "Yes, I'm just tired," I replied, trying to hide the truth. But I knew I couldn't go on like this for long. I needed to find a way to reconcile my feelings for Jake and my life with Michael. And that required quick and precise decisions to avoid everything falling apart. While I was planning my meetings with Jake, I was also thinking about how to keep Michael away from any suspicion. I created elaborate lies about meetings and work commitments. Every time I came up with a new excuse, I felt a knot in my stomach. But I also felt a rush of adrenaline that kept me going. The pleasure of taking risks was intoxicating, and it kept me connected to Jake in a way I couldn't explain. One night, while Michael was asleep, I decided to send Jake a message. "We need to talk," I wrote. He replied immediately, "I'm here. What's up?" I was relieved to see his reply. "I just needed to hear your voice," I confessed. "Let's meet tomorrow," he suggested. "I'll be waiting for you in the little house in the garden." I agreed, feeling my heart race with anticipation. The next day, I met up with Jake as arranged. As soon as our gazes met, all my worries disappeared. "I'm here," he said, pulling me into a hug. Feeling his body against mine was all I needed at that moment. "We need to be careful," I whispered. "I know," he replied, kissing me softly. "But it's worth it." And in that moment, I knew that, despite all the challenges, I wasn't ready to give up on Jake. Even if it meant living a double life, with all its complexities and risks. Jake suggested we spend a weekend out of town. The idea sounded crazy, but I was so caught up in the adrenaline and passion that I couldn't say no. The offer was tempting. We would spend 2 days away from everything and everyone, without the shadow of guilt hanging over us. He looked at me with those intense eyes and said, "We need some time to ourselves, away from prying eyes." I nodded, my heart beating out of rhythm. I needed to create a convincing lie for Michael. I invented a business trip, something he wouldn't question. "Honey, there's an important conference at the weekend. I have to go," I said, trying not to be nervous. "Michael, as always, trusted me. "All right, darling. Good luck and take care," he replied with a smile. When the day came, I said goodbye to Michael with a kiss on the cheek, feeling a lump in my throat. Guilt began to eat away at me, but the excitement of meeting Jake drove me on. I picked up my suitcase and drove to the meeting point. Jake was waiting for me, and when I saw him, all my doubts disappeared. He wrapped me in a tight hug and whispered in my ear, "This weekend is going to be unforgettable." We got into the car and drove off, talking about everything and nothing, trying to stifle the anxiety and tension that hung in the air. We arrived at the hotel in the late afternoon. It was a discreet place, perfect for our getaway. Jake checked in while I observed the surroundings, trying to calm down. We went up to the room, and as soon as the door closed, he pulled me close and kissed me with an intensity that made me forget everything. Our hands explored every inch of each other's bodies, as if we were trying to absorb every moment. That night was one of unbridled passion. The hotel bed seemed to be the only place in the world I wanted to be. Jake and I gave ourselves completely to each other, without reservation, without fear. Whispers, moans, and silent promises filled the room. The intensity of the moment made me forget the reality outside, even for a few hours. The next morning, I woke up in Jake's arms. The sun was streaming in through the window and illuminating his face. He was asleep, and I watched, trying to record every detail. Remorse came back to haunt me, but at the same time, there was a feeling of completeness, something I hadn't felt for a long time. We got up, had breakfast at the hotel, and spent the day exploring the city. Every moment with Jake was a mixture of happiness and fear. He held my hand, looked at me tenderly, and I felt as if we were living a dream. At the end of the day, we went back to the hotel room. The sexual tension between us was palpable, and once again we gave ourselves to each other. The fear of being discovered mixed with the adrenaline made everything even more intense. Jake whispered in my ear, "I want this moment to last forever." I knew it wasn't possible, but for now I allowed myself to believe. As the weekend drew to a close, reality began to weigh on us again. We needed to go back, face our lives, and pretend that nothing had happened. On the way back, the silence between us was comfortable, but full of meaning. Jake held my hand and said, "It doesn't end here. Let's find a way to continue." I knew he was right, but the fear of being discovered consumed me. Arriving home, Michael welcomed me with a warm hug. "How was the conference?" he asked, and I replied with a fake smile. "It was great, but I'm glad to be back." That night, lying next to Michael, guilt and excitement mixed in my mind. I knew I was playing with fire, but the passion for Jake was something I couldn't control. The remorse was there, but the adrenaline of living that secret made everything seem more intense, more real. The weekend out of town had been an escape, a moment of pure passion and freedom. But now, back in the routine, reality was imposing itself again. I had to find a way to continue living this double life without anyone finding out. And as I looked to the future, I knew that the betrayal would continue, a secret kept under lock and key, fueled by a passion that seemed to have no end. I was in a constant internal dilemma with each passing day. The decision to continue with the affair and keep the secret with Jake wasn't easy, but it seemed inevitable. I knew that betrayal was ingrained in my routine, intertwined in my life with Michael, and the clandestine meetings with Jake. The double life I was leading was exhausting, but at the same time, every meeting with Jake was a relief, an escape from the monotonous everyday life. "Are you going to be able to go out today?" Jake asked as he finished mowing the lawn. I stood on the balcony, watching him with a mixture of desire and guilt. "Yes, Michael has a meeting in the evening. We can meet in the garden house, I replied, trying to disguise the anxiety in my voice. He smiled, that smile that melted me inside, and nodded. The double routine was exhausting. I had to pretend to be normal with Michael, while my heart and body yearned for Jake. Every time Michael hugged or kissed me, I felt a crushing weight of guilt. Sometimes I would catch myself looking at him sleeping next to me, and remorse would consume me. But at the same time, I knew that the betrayal would continue. There was no stopping it. "Are you sure you want to carry on with this?" Jake asked me one night as we sat together in the little house in the garden. He was lying next to me, his breathing still labored after our passionate encounter. "Yes," I answered without hesitation, even though a part of me was screaming at me to stop. I can't go back anymore. Every encounter with Jake was a mixture of pleasure and fear. The fear of being discovered, of losing everything I had built with Michael, but the adrenaline rush of being with Jake was addictive. I found it increasingly difficult to separate the emotions between the two worlds. When I was with Michael, I thought of Jake. And when I was with Jake, I remembered Michael. It was a vicious cycle. One evening, while we were together in the little house in the garden, Jake looked me in the eye and said, "I want more than this. I want you for myself." "Jake, you know I can't just leave everything," I replied, feeling a lump in my throat. "Michael doesn't deserve that. But you deserve to be happy too," he insisted, holding my hand. "And I know you're not happy with him." The truth was hard to admit, but Jake was right. My relationship with Michael hadn't been the same for a long time. But the certainty that the betrayal would continue, without revelations or consequences, was something I couldn't let go of. I wasn't ready to face reality. Every day was a new internal battle. Guilt and desire fought inside me, and I didn't know how much longer I could endure this double life. But for now, the betrayal would continue, and I would live every moment with Jake as if it were my last, keeping the secret that could destroy everything.